Good afternoon, everyone. We would like to welcome you today to our presentation titled Treating Athletes with Eating Disorders and Unhealthy Sport Environments. I'm going to first mention a few things to note. Participants will be muted upon entry and videos turned off. For technical assistance, please use the chat box located at the bottom of your screens. Third, you will receive an email approximately 1 month from today requesting feedback and impact on today's presentation. We also ask that you visit us at www.nseedus.org/training to view other training opportunities that we have within our training library. I'll go ahead and introduce today's speaker. Today's speaker is Ms. Rachel Flatt, a 2010 Olympian, U.S. national champion, and world junior champion in women's figure skating. She is also a 3-time world team member with a top finish of 5th and a 4-time senior Grand Prix silver medalist. After retiring from skating in 2014, she graduated from Stanford University with a bachelor's in biology and a minor in psychology. She then served as the programs director at the Center for M2 Health and managed several research studies that leverage digital mental health tools to improve treatment outcomes, particularly for eating disorders. In 2018, she began her doctoral studies in UNC's Chapel Hill's clinical psychology program under the mentorship of Dr. Cynthia Bulick, where she researches eating disorders with a focus on digital mental health tools and athlete mental health. She continues to play an active role in the sports community as an athlete representative for the U.S. Olympic and Paralympic Committee's Mental Health Task Force and Racial and Social Justice Council, and on U.S. Figure Skating's Board of Directors, among other positions. I will now turn things over to Ms. Rachel Flatt. And as a reminder, today's presentation will be recorded and available via NSEED's training library 1 week from today.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Lachelle, for that introduction. It's always funny to hear those accolades read back to you, but thank you all so much for joining today. As Lachelle said, we're going to be talking about treating athletes with eating disorders and unhealthy sport environments. One quick disclosure is that I have a National Science Foundation grant through the Graduate Research Fellowship Program. And in terms of the objectives for today, I'm hoping you all will feel comfortable kind of describing some core treatment considerations for athletes with eating disorders, primarily based on their level of care, including how to kind of navigate some of the complexities with exercise, given that that's a huge component of an athlete's lifestyle. I also hope that you'll be able to critically evaluate larger systemic and cultural risk and maintenance factors that many athletes face with eating disorders. And then also thinking about how you can participate in changing the culture around eating disorders in sports, since this is a problem that we continue to face and is something that we are certainly making strides on improving, but still have a ways to go. So in terms of the agenda today, I won't talk a ton about the specific treatment of eating disorders for specific types of eating disorders, since NSEED has some great webinars on that already. So what I'm going to do today is spend a little bit of time talking about the different levels of care for athletes with eating disorders and really specific considerations based on those levels of care, and crafting a return to play plan for athletes who are re-entering the sport context. Then we'll spend a bit of time talking about unhealthy sport environments, since that can certainly play a role in treatment, but they aren't necessarily discussed as often. So I'll talk a little bit about what this looks like in terms of immediate local environments, as well as a broader perspective in terms of systemic and cultural aspects, kind of the overarching sport environment. And then I'll save a few minutes at the end for some question and answers. But before we jump into that, I wanted to take a brief moment to talk a little bit about why this is something that should be discussed more often and why we should be concerned about eating disorders in athletes. Certainly from a personal experience, as LaShawn mentioned, I was an elite figure skater for many years and certainly saw the toll that eating disorders can take on elite level athletes and how that can not only impact their career, but also their overall livelihood and their transition out of sport into retirement and into other things beyond sport. But certainly dealt with body image myself and certainly understand how sport can play a role with both the onset of an eating disorder and the maintenance of an eating disorder. So this is something that I'm very passionate about, but certainly there are other issues here at play outside of anecdotal evidence that are really important and pertain to why we should be talking about eating disorders in sport more often. So first of all, the prevalence is generally at least as high in athletes, if not higher than the general population in many cases. The general population prevalence is somewhere between 1 and 5 or 6%, but it can actually be upwards of 30% in some samples of elite athletes. This can certainly be related to unique sport-specific risk factors, which definitely includes the sport in which athletes participate. So for instance, aesthetic sports like figure skating or diving or gymnastics, weight class sports like wrestling, endurance sports like long distance running certainly have higher prevalence estimates than other sports. There's also sport-related risk factors, including early sport specialization, exposure to traumatic injuries, and having to wear kind of revealing sports gear or uniforms, and objectification of athlete bodies that occur so often in the media that can definitely contribute to some of the elevated risk of both eating disorder onset and maintenance in this population. Of course, eating disorders have a number of negative consequences for athletes' health and wellness, but not only are these detrimental to their performance or their likelihood of developing injuries, but obviously it's detrimental to their long-term health and wellness post-sport. Unfortunately, there are some, folks in the sports community that operate as part of support teams that can be primarily concerned with the health of the athletes just so they can perform and do their jobs as athletes. But that can kind of reflect some of the unhealthy sport environment that folks might encounter. And instead, we really need to focus on the athlete's health and wellness from a holistic perspective, not just so that they can get back on the field and play, but because they're a human and absolutely deserve treatment to help ensure that they're happy and healthy as a person first and as an athlete second. So in terms of the level of care to consider, obviously there are quite a few steps here that athletes may enter treatment, or they may step up or step down certain levels of care, which could include hospitalization, residential treatment programs, intensive outpatient or partial hospitalization programs, and outpatient programs. So I'll quickly talk a little bit about what each of those levels of care might look like in case you aren't familiar with those. So in terms of hospitalization, this is certainly the highest level of care. Folks who are going to be at this level of care have the most severe eating disorder pathology. In most cases, these are folks with severe anorexia nervosa, but they might also present with severe cases of bulimia nervosa or ARFID. These folks are usually medically unstable or have really high risk levels, which could include endorsement of, suicidal ideation with a plan, intent, and means, and may be at a point where they feel that they need intense meal supervision in order to ensure that they can progress down to a lower level of treatment. Oftentimes, this consists of a really high-level multidisciplinary team where they provide the athletes with around-the-clock care. So the teams can often consist of physicians, psychiatrists, psychologists, registered dietitians, nurses, occupational therapists, recreational therapists. It's a huge team in many cases. But these are folks who are usually quite sick and really warrant that level of supervision 24/7. The goals typically for this level of care are oftentimes crisis management, helping the athletes regain weight, and certainly engage in nutritional rehabilitation. And also, in addition to that, we want to make sure that there's a reduction of harmful behaviors, whether those are eating disorder behaviors or potentially self-harm behaviors. We just want to get them to a point where they're medically stable before discharging them to a lower level of care. So the next step down here is residential care. Again, these folks typically have pretty severe eating disorder pathology still. Sometimes they may still have low weight, and they still are at a point where they really need quite a bit of multidisciplinary care still. If they are stepping down from hospitalization, at this point, they will have returned to a point where they are medically stable and have had a decent amount of risk mitigation. These folks also still have a decent amount of psychological impairment. So for instance, they have high levels of functional impairment. They may not be able to return 100% to daily tasks on their own and still need quite a bit of help with meals, for instance, but also have really intense weight and shape concerns, and are not at a point quite yet where they can step down to a lower level of care. Sometimes folks at this level of care will also have they'll require some additional support because they don't necessarily have adequate at-home support. So sometimes the parents, the family system, or home life could be really unstable, and the home system is just unable to provide the support that is needed, especially for younger individuals while they work through recovery. Could certainly also be the case for an athlete with a severe eating disorder who's a college level athlete who's far from home, doesn't feel like they can kind of adequately take care of themselves without substantial support. The goals for this level of care, again, are still centered around weight regain and stabilization, reduction of eating disorder behaviors, and kind of this preparation for lower levels of care. So obviously want to focus on improving their level of functioning and impairment, working towards setting themselves up for success as they step down to a lower level of care. Kind of this mid-range level of treatment can consist of either intensive outpatient treatment or partial hospitalization programs. These folks tend to have moderate eating disorder pathology that's too severe for outpatient management alone. So sometimes they are either stepping up from outpatient care or stepping down from either hospitalization or residential care. So for instance, say an athlete who has been in outpatient care has been continuously and steadily losing weight despite being engaged in this type of treatment. They're medically stable, but they still need quite a bit of help with meal and snack management. So this might be a good level of care for those athletes. Sometimes these levels of care also have slightly smaller multidisciplinary teams, and it's certainly not around the clock care either. So it may be a bit of a transition for folks to go from higher levels of care with around the clock care to that smaller step down, so that they're still getting quite a bit of daily contact as needed with quite a few members of the multidisciplinary treatment team. But it's moving them to a place where they're starting to get a little bit more independence in their schedule. Goals here, again, reduction of eating disorder behaviors. You start thinking about skill generalization and practice, and helping them ensure that the transition down to a lower level of care, down to outpatient treatment, goes smoothly so that there is some weight maintenance or continuation of weight regain as needed. And then finally, the last level of care that I'll talk about here is outpatient treatment. So folks at this level of care will often have mild to moderate eating disorder pathology, and sometimes for athletes, they will oftentimes show up with RED-S, which is the relative energy deficiency in sport. And you might also see this in the research as referenced as low energy availability. So this is really where athletes aren't getting enough calories to support their normal functioning, such that they're kind of overtraining or exercising too much without adequate calorie consumption, despite kind of normal eating habits. or they might be engaging in disordered eating behaviors to intentionally reduce their caloric balance. And certainly this can coexist with other eating disorder pathology like weight and shape concerns. But you'll still see other psychological and physiological consequences because of the low energy availability, which can range from things like GI issues and musculoskeletal problems and cardiac abnormalities to comorbid anxiety, depression, poor concentration, et cetera. There's a whole host of other issues that might show up with RED-S. For outpatient care, there are also less frequent meetings with members of the multidisciplinary team. And again, this might be a little bit smaller than what we'd see at the higher levels of care. So oftentimes this is including a dietitian, a physician, psychologist, and a psychiatrist, especially if there's any medication usage being or that the athletes are currently taking. And in addition to that, the goals here are really full abstinence from the eating disorder behaviors, weight maintenance, and stability long-term, kind of reduction of weight and shape concerns, increasing the overall independence of the athletes, especially if they're under the age of 18, and helping them build out those skills so that they can engage in regular eating and meal habits without the help of their parents, and then also addressing any additional comorbid psychiatric illnesses. In terms of the effective forms of psychotherapy that are used throughout these levels of care, there's a few evidence-based treatments that have pretty decent response rates, but obviously we still need a little bit more research here in terms of the treatment options that are most effective in reducing relapse, since eating disorders still continue to have pretty high relapse rates. So for athletes, certainly the effective forms of psychotherapy are the same as non-athletes, but these treatments can certainly be tailored to address some of the sport-specific risk factors or maintenance factors. So for adolescents here, we've got family-based treatment, which is the top line treatment. This is really where the family takes the lead, and it's designed primarily for outpatient care. There's 3 phases where the family kind of initially takes charge of the meal planning and reduction of eating disorder behaviors. And then in the second and third phases, the treatment team kind of works with the family and the adolescent to return control of meals to the adolescent, and then helps them kind of build out other life skills and establishing their independence. For adults, the best form of treatment is still cognitive behavioral therapy or enhanced cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBTE, which again focuses on abstinence from eating disorder behaviors, weight regain and stability, followed by addressing weight and shape concerns and relapse prevention. Certainly, there are some additional effective forms of psychotherapy out there, including dialectical behavior therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, and interpersonal psychotherapy. But they aren't quite as well researched and often are used as a second line of care, or sometimes specific skills from these frameworks are kind of pulled into either FBT or CBTE kind of as a supplemental basis. In terms of what is covered at each treatment check-in for athletes with eating disorders, there's a whole host of things that can be addressed here, but a few things that I wanted to make sure that you all are aware of in terms of what at least should be addressed at each check-in. Certainly want to make sure that athletes are assessed in terms of their physical and psychological functioning and impairment. Certainly want to get an understanding of where their eating disorder behaviors are in relation to the last meeting. So that includes looking at binge eating and all the compensatory behaviors, including vomiting and diuretic and laxative misuse, restrictive eating or fasting, and certainly any maladaptive exercise behaviors. For athletes specifically, want to make sure that maladaptive exercise behaviors are really well assessed, especially in relation to the athlete's training load, so that there's a clear understanding of what the caloric intake and outputs are, and also making sure that this is a healthy place for them to either continue engaging in exercise or potentially taking that down a notch to ensure that their weight stabilizes, and so that they're getting adequate caloric intake and nutritional intake. Certainly want to make sure you do a check on their weight and shape concerns to see if and how those have changed over time. Obviously want to do a physical exam, which would include any weight changes. Certainly with athletes who are competing at high levels or have high training loads, definitely want to look at menstruation status here too. And then certainly if there's any medications that are currently being used and other health needs, those are great places to have a discussion here as well. In terms of some of the other health needs, this is also where RED-S might show up. So being able to use something like the REDS CAT screener, which the International Olympic Committee put together, that might be a useful tool to use here to better understand what some of the additional health concerns might be in relation to some of the eating disorder psychopathology. So one of the things that is important here for athletes in particular is that there may be a slightly expanded multidisciplinary treatment team. Excuse me. This is a great model that Convisor, Tierney, and Nichols put together a few years ago that is fantastic in helping kind of figure out who all should be incorporated into the athlete's treatment. So certainly, at the center of the model here is the athlete to ensure that every member of the team is helping support their recovery. Certainly, parents and a family therapist are essential in navigating treatment when the athlete's under 18, but can also be equally helpful for athletes who have really severe eating disorders and may initially be resistant to treatment. Of course, we want to make sure that there's a psychologist and a registered dietitian involved to help ensure that the athlete is making strides on their coping and communication skills. Eating disorders are highly comorbid with a history of trauma. So certainly making sure that that's a key piece of assessment on the psychology front, and on the dietitian front, like doing quite a bit of meal planning, nutrition education, and weight monitoring are essential here. Definitely want to include a psychiatrist here as well, especially if there's any medication management that's occurring. But these last three buckets at the bottom here are additional folks that might be folks that that aren't usually included for folks who are not athletes that are seeking treatment. So on the bottom left here, we've got physicians, athletic trainers, and physical therapists. These are a great group of folks who involve in terms of this multidisciplinary care, in part because athletes want to be healthy and safe in returning to training or their competition. And obviously eating disorders can be associated with increased injury rates. So making sure that athletic trainers and physical therapists are involved here and understand where this athlete is in terms of their treatment and their recovery process is essential. Sometimes coaches might also be involved, especially at lower levels of care, to help the athlete understand what is going to be safe and effective in terms of their training and competition levels. And that's something that may be more difficult for the remainder of the team to identify, or for the athlete themselves to identify, especially if they've got really severe eating disorder pathology and impairment. And then finally, this last bucket, folks from the athletic administration. So for athletes that are competing either through high school sports or college sports or pro teams, these are going to be great individuals to at least involve, to have a better understanding of what the impacts might be in terms of the athlete's eligibility, their compliance, and their financial support, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But this is a great cohesive and holistic team to ensure that the athlete's getting the best care possible, and also understands how eating disorder treatment, especially if they have to take a step back from their sport, might impact their athletic career. So in terms of some of the considerations for athletes in treatment based on their levels of care, One of the primary misnomers for folks, especially in these high levels of care, is that they shouldn't be engaging in any physical activity. And in fact, there's actually some recent research out there that indicates low levels of physical activity can be helpful. But certainly before going down that road, it's essential to evaluate if and how any maladaptive exercise behaviors like compulsive exercise may be contributing to the overall eating disorder picture. Certainly, if an athlete is medically unstable, treatment teams wouldn't necessarily open up many forms of physical activity, but it can certainly be helpful in lowering the risk of severe medical complications like DVTs, and can help an athlete retain their flexibility if they're allowed to stretch, or even just feel connected with their sport, which can certainly provide psychological benefits if getting back to competition is a strong motivator for treatment. In addition to some of the considerations at high levels of care related to physical activity, certainly these folks who are in inpatient units or residential programs most likely will have a significant time away from sport. It is unlikely that athletes at these levels of care will be cleared to train at full force, let alone compete. In fact, the average length of time individuals are hospitalized or in residential treatment programs for eating disorders is a little over 2 months, which could certainly be a decent chunk of time for a competitive season for an athlete. And certainly this could have a number of consequences in terms of eligibility or financial support from a college athletics department or professional sport organization. So that's why it's really important to have the folks on the admin teams be a part of some of these conversations so that athletes and the remainder of the treatment team have a really good understanding of how seeking treatment might impact some of the athlete's sport career. In addition to that, time away from sport can certainly have psychological benefits and consequences. Being able to identify some of the pros and cons related to taking a break from the sport can be really important. Some of the pros could be, an opportunity to identify some of the problematic aspects of the sports environment, maybe getting a time away from a coach who is constantly criticizing weight, or giving the athlete an opportunity to just really get healthy and stronger and maybe recover from eating disorder related injuries. Certainly on the flip side, though, is, athletes might experience some, possible psychological consequences because maybe the return to competition is a huge motivator for treatment. And so if the contact from with sport is reduced quite a bit, maybe the athlete isn't experiencing the social benefits of being around their team and feeling that type of support encouragement. So there are a lot of things to kind of suss out at these levels to understand what some of the immediate impacts might be on the athlete's psychological state and having that time away from the sport. One other thing that I think is going to be important to start integrating into all levels of care, but especially at high levels of care, is understanding the athlete identity. So this is the extent to which an athlete or an individual kind of identifies as an athlete and how strongly they internalize that. It's really helpful to understand and evaluate this construct, especially if the eating disorder is tied to the individual's desire to perform well in their sport. Oftentimes, we're starting to see a significant relationship between the intensity of athlete identity as well as the severity of eating disorder pathology. So understanding that link, understanding how the sport may be kind of manifesting in terms of how the eating disorder is playing out is going to be really important for setting up future treatment goals. And one more thing that I'll mention here too at high levels of care is that if the athletic support team is not really involved in some of these higher levels of care, so for instance, say a high school athlete is coming in for a high level of care, but really their main support team is their coach, but they aren't really able to be highly involved with treatment and with the multidisciplinary treatment team, in part because of all of the other constraints on their time. One of the things that can be helpful here is having a discussion with the athlete about what information they want to share and with whom, and in terms of their overall sport environment and who they have contact with routinely. Coming up with a good game plan about that early on can be helpful in determining what and who will be involved in their later levels of treatment. This is also a great opportunity to spend some time kind of educating the team around the athlete. So for instance, if a coach is problematic in terms of the negative coaching comments that they're making about an athlete's weight or shape, this is a great opportunity for those individuals to take some time, get some additional education and training so that they are no longer contributing to the maintenance of the eating disorder when that athlete returns to the sport. And then at these high levels of care, this is a point at which you can start planning the continuity of care prior to stepping down, especially as those folks might regain some contact with the athlete. But it may not be a point at which you are fully integrating that team right off the bat. So this is a good opportunity to take care of some planning before the athlete steps down to a lower level of care. Well, I guess as athletes kind of either step down to lower levels of care, these mid-ranges of care from either being hospitalized or in a residential program, or if they are stepping up from outpatient care, there are a few additional considerations to keep in mind. Specific to physical activity here. The level of activity may be a little bit higher here than the highest levels of care. So it should be kind of conceptualized as a transitional state of physical activity. Should be time limited and very closely monitored in person, especially if the athlete does have a history of maladaptive exercise behaviors. And this can also be seen as an opportunity to really help the athlete regain contact with the sport and include some social support with their coaches, with their teammates, with other training mates, etc. What is really important here, though, is to evaluate the athlete's perception of reduced amounts of physical activity. So say they are increasing their their physical activity load from the lower levels of care, or if they're having to take things down a notch from either outpatient care or from a full training load, it's really helpful to understand how they are responding to that physically. That could be, looked at from a physiological metrics perspective, but also understanding how they are receiving that kind of step down psychologically. We really want to understand if these athletes in particular, we don't want them to inadvertently begin engaging in maladaptive exercise behaviors if that's not part of their overall eating disorder pathology. So really helping them have a clear understanding of how exercise can function healthily in their lives, as well as their participation in sport, can be really important. So this is a great opportunity to have that discussion. And then if maladaptive exercise behaviors are definitely present, this is a great opportunity and level of care to start developing and initiating an exercise return to play plan, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. More often than not, this is fully initiated and implemented at lower levels of care, just kind of depending on the length of time that athletes are at mid-range levels of care. But certainly this is a great opportunity to start talking about that with an athlete and with the overall multidisciplinary care team to understand what things might look like down the road and start coming up with treatment targets here. In addition to that, athletes in mid-range levels of care certainly may have reduced contact with their sport environment. So certainly want to have a similar discussion here in terms of psychological and career benefits and consequences, similar to what I mentioned before. But this is also a great opportunity to start talking about motivations for continued treatment. Sometimes at those higher levels of care, especially if folks aren't in those hospitalization or residential programs for a long amount of time, this is a really good place to start having conversations here about what is going to help this athlete continue through treatment, since it's not the easiest thing. One aspect that may come up here for athletes with eating disorders, and this actually does come up more often than you'd think, is a desire to actually stop competing, in part because sometimes an eating disorder can be so severe, can really complicate an athlete's understanding of their desire to continue participating in sport. So when they have that reduced contact with that sport environment, you kind of open that door to discussing whether or not they want to continue competing, and help them understand if the sport environment is a safe place for them to continue, or if it maybe is a place for them where they need to change a number of things in order to continue and make sure that the eating disorder does not come back. If the athletic support team, again, here is not involved or not really heavily involved in these mid-range levels of care, these are the opportunities to really take some time to begin that implementation of continuity of care with that athletic support team. So making sure that a plan is in place, we're starting that communication and helping the athlete understand what may be expected of them down the line. Again, here we might begin or continue the education of that support team, especially if there are problematic members here, to ensure that they do not contribute to eating disorder relapse. And then having a plan for either stepping up or stepping down for the athlete in the event that their eating disorder symptoms worsen or improve. In terms of the low levels of care, one of the things that I wanted to focus on briefly here was a review paper that Cook and some colleagues did put together back in 2016 in terms of the gradual reinstatement of physical activity, since low levels of care are really going to be the place where most athletes begin fully reintegrating sport into their lifestyle. So a few things that a few themes that were identified in this review of research papers really helped shape the recommendations in terms of how to incorporate exercise. And you can see all of those on the right. But certainly there's a consensus around having a multidisciplinary team, certainly continuing to monitor medical status and safety concerns, and screening for kind of maladaptive eating disorder behaviors. But one of the things that can be really helpful in helping the athlete agree to this stepped kind of gradual reinstatement of physical activity is creating a written contract of how and when exercise is actually going to be used in treatment, so that it's very clear the entire team is agreeing to it and that there can be any adjustments made as needed. One of the things that is super important here is including a psychoeducational component. So helping the athletes understand what is a healthy relationship with exercise. For instance, what contributed to some of their maladaptive exercise behaviors in the past, how they can prevent that in the future. And ensuring that they have really high levels of awareness. So potentially using some mindfulness exercises to help them understand some of the cognitions and emotions that might come up with exercise down the line as they start reintegrating that into their treatment and into their life. Again, really want to focus on positive reinforcement, kind of creating that graded program so that you're starting with mild intensity and building slowly. And then also thinking about tailoring the types of exercise to the needs of the individual. So for instance, thinking about, is this someone who really engaged in a lot of compulsive exercise related to cardio types of exercise in the past? Maybe that's not quite where we want to start. And instead, it might be focused a little bit more on some gentle weightlifting or stretching or yoga before reintroducing some cardio type of exercises that were more problematic beforehand. And then, of course, having some nutritional components to kind of account for some of the physiological needs during the exercise, and then having a good debrief session afterwards to help the athletes understand like what went well, maybe what didn't, what can be improved in the future, and maybe what needs to change in terms of the contract that was initially created, or the graded program that was initially created, to ensure that they are engaging in healthy exercise and reinstating this physical activity in a way that is going to be sustainable long term. At this point in low levels of care, certainly there is going to be re-entry into the sport context for athletes who decide that they do want to continue competing. One thing to keep in mind here is that sometimes athletes will have seasonal disordered eating behaviors. So for instance, it's really common in weight class sports for athletes to engage in some compensatory eating behaviors. So maybe vomiting or misuse of diuretics and laxatives to lose weight to meet their weight class, which may trigger the onset of an eating disorder again down the line. So being able to have a clear understanding of if and when those types of disordered eating behaviors may come up throughout the kind of continuum of a season is essential here, that may not be so present in non-athletes. One thing that is usually addressed here as well at these low levels of care, especially in outpatient, when there's certainly time to address some of these sport-related risk and maintenance factors, is making sure that athletes have a clear understanding of what about their environment, or in terms of their support team, who may have been contributing to some of the eating disorder risk and maintenance. Again, having a conversation around athlete identity and sport-related relapse prevention are key goals and can be really helpful in the athlete's overall prognosis and their successful trajectory and re-entry back into sport. And then last but not least here, this is the point at which you'd want full multidisciplinary team integration. So making sure that there is, this continuity of care implemented, especially if an athlete is stepping down from higher levels of care. We want to make sure that the athletic support team still has continued education around what the athlete may need, and just generally eating disorder education, so that they know what to look for down the line in the event that the athlete relapses. And then also ensuring that there's any alterations of the team training approaches to successfully reduce eating disorder risk down the line. So that was a quick glance of some of the considerations here based on the levels of care for athletes. Last but not least, though, before we jump into the unhealthy sport environments, is a quick overview of what a return to play plan might look like. So I had mentioned this a little bit beforehand, but this is a document that can be created and discussed and signed off by all members of the multidisciplinary treatment team and the athlete. So this is really supposed to be a collaborative effort. This is not supposed to be the treatment team saying, here's what you need to do. Ideally, the athlete is heavily involved in the creation of this document. Some of the components that you might consider including are attendance of regular meetings with the multidisciplinary team, thinking about frequency of communication. So for instance, if some of the members of the team are not as heavily involved like coaches, if they are busy with other students or with other teams, making sure that there is a clear understanding of how often they will be communicating with the overall team, to ensure that there is a clear understanding of what next steps are. In addition to that, we want to ensure that regular eating habits are built in here. So for instance, if you're adhering to kind of the CVTE format, making sure that the athlete is agreeing to 3 meals a day, 2 to 3 snacks every day is helpful to build in here, as well as abstinence from disordered eating behaviors. Certainly, you can include metrics related to weight regain or maintenance, as well as the frequency of weight checks, so that it kind of removes some of the stigma related to those discussions, but also makes it very clear in writing what the expectations are. And then in addition to that, for athletes specifically, want to focus on the prescribed training and physical activity loads. So, on a couple of slides ago, being able to incorporate some of the reintegration to physical activity types of metrics can be helpful in building that into the overall return to play plan, so that the whole team understands what the expectations are, the athlete knows what they might get to look forward to, and helps the entire treatment team build out long-term steps for success and for sustainable treatment gains. If there are any measurable changes in the sport context that need to change, this is also a great place to put that in, whether or not that's the athlete's responsibility. May be something that's unique to their case. Again, this could be related to coaching or parenting concerns, or any related negative comparisons or weight checks that are done, for instance, at the ice rink or something, or on the field, like making sure that those are no longer part of the picture and are only done in the medical context, can be helpful things to identify and include here. The last couple things here that you definitely want to include are any criteria that would warrant changes in stepped care. So for instance, if the athlete is currently at an outpatient level, thinking through what criteria would warrant them to increase their level of care and move up, or if they are currently at a moderate level of care, what it might look like if they are able to step down. And if any of these requirements are not met, one thing that can be helpful in increasing the likelihood of the athlete following through is having really clear consequences if the requirements aren't met. But on the flip side, also having really clear rewards and benefits if the requirements are met. So being able to focus on, for instance, the athlete's ability to make really substantial training gains once they've recovered from their eating disorder, or being able to have a longevity in the sport because they're no longer getting eating disorder related injuries. Those can be helpful things to have on that document to ensure that there's continued motivation. So in the last few minutes, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about unhealthy sport environments. And obviously, I've spent most of the presentation kind of talking about person level interventions for the athlete, but we all know that the unhealthy sport environments can really contribute negatively to eating disorder risk, onset, and maintenance. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the overall sports environment as a place where we can also intervene and conceptualize it as part of the overall treatment for athletes with eating disorders. Before we intervene, though, we need to know what some of the indicators are of unhealthy training environments. So I've alluded to some of these already as I've gone through this presentation, but certainly key indicator here are negative comments from coaches or support staff on weight or shape. And this can certainly include fat talk. So this is something that often comes up with athletes who have publicly discussed their eating disorder or their history of an eating disorder, and noting that sometimes coaches or members of support staff might make cursory comments about the athlete's weight and saying, oh gosh, you are really looking bloated today, or you've really gained some weight, and it would be much easier for you to continue competing if you were to lose weight. Those types of comments can certainly be really detrimental to an athlete's overall psychological state of mind. And so looking for that as an indicator of an unhealthy training environment is something that comes up frequently. Sometimes there's also social comparison and team dynamics and pressure. So occasionally there may be instances of athletes kind of comparing their jersey size, or talking about the size of their legs, for instance, or their BMI percentages or fat percentages, as a comparison, especially when they're getting these metrics assessed often. And so those types of team dynamics and the normalization of those types of conversations or pressures can certainly come up when an athlete is talking about what contributed to their eating disorder. Sometimes in certain sports and in sport environments, there may be some encouragement or normalization of harmful weight management behaviors. So for instance, like what I mentioned earlier with say wrestling or weight class sports, oftentimes you'll hear stories about athletes exercising, for hours on end with garbage bags over them to try and sweat off additional weight. Certainly those might be normalized behaviors in some sports, but may actually contribute to an eating disorder for some athletes. And so trying to understand if that's present in an athlete's immediate environment can be helpful to mitigating that risk down the line. Again, weight checks, body checking as well. So for instance, if athletes are kind of looking at themselves in a mirror and kind of pinching and pulling at their waist or their arms, or trying to see what their body might look like if it was a different shape. Both of these aspects may confer some additional eating disorder risk, as well as the messaging that comes up often in some of these aesthetically based sports or judge sports, that lower weight is equivalent to increasing the likelihood of your success. So these are some general indicators of unhealthy training environments that may come up in an athlete's local environment. But in addition to that, there may be some systemic and cultural risks that come up during an athlete's life cycle. Certainly from a developmental stage, there may be, kind of this lack of education of the team around the athlete. Generally speaking, there's very little public education around eating disorders, unfortunately. But that may be taken to another level in relation to how little education is available in terms of sport-specific risk factors for eating disorders, for instance, among the team. So that, in addition to some of the team and staff dynamics that I've discussed already, may be really present at some of these developmental stages for athletes. Unfortunately, for some of the younger athletes who are coming up through the sport, oftentimes there is not an overarching multidisciplinary team available to them at their fingertips like it would be available at a Division I athletics department. Oftentimes they have to identify kind of piecemeal support, and there's a really tremendous lack of continuity and different messaging that comes up. So sometimes it can be hard for those athletes and their families to understand what they should be looking for, if some of the messages they're receiving are problematic, and how it may contribute to an eating disorder. And again, there may be some sport-specific risk factors and normalization of eating disorders and eating disorder behaviors that may come up that are kind of part of the indoctrination into a sport, unfortunately. And so it takes a lot of unlearning later in a career or later in life for an athlete to understand what was problematic about being in a specific sport or a specific sport environment, and how that may have contributed to their eating disorder. In terms of what comes up at some of the elite stages, there's a lot of athletes who have certainly talked about the pressures of being a public figure and the overall objectification of athlete bodies, and how that can put a lot of pressure on them to maintain a certain physique, even if their bodies are changing as they grow through puberty, or as their physique changes, as they kind of alter their training regimens. So that can be a key point for these elite athletes that comes up when their visibility increases. In addition to that, sometimes within sport organizations, there is an issue with perceived legitimacy and emphasis on mental health and eating disorders generally. And in most cases, there isn't a specific mode of support for at the organizational level for athletes to go seek treatment. So only in a few slim cases do athletes actually have the resources, the support, the insurance coverage to pay for high-level eating disorder treatment as needed. But on top of that, if the mental health concerns or eating disorder concerns aren't legitimized in the first place, it can be really difficult to get athletes to seek treatment in the first place. In addition to that, elite athletes tend to be a pretty protected research pool. So it makes it really difficult to understand some of the nuances for this population and for those demographics. And hopefully down the line, there can be a little bit more open communication and research done on this group of athletes so that we can understand, as an athlete progresses through the sport, what may change in terms of their eating disorder risk or onset or maintenance. But that will hopefully be something that's addressed down the line. Excuse me. Finally, for the last group of athletes here that I have here are folks that are entering retirement. Unfortunately, there is a tremendous lack of preparation. Talk to most athletes who are currently competing or even close to retirement, and that's the last thing they want to talk about. They do not want to talk about what is next for them after sport in most cases. And compounding that is the fact that there is a tremendous lack of designated services. In most cases, athletes have insurance coverage that goes up until they finish competing or finish training. And then as soon as they retire, those resources and support cease to exist. So being able to help athletes prepare for that change, those designated services continuing after their retirement can be really helpful in reducing eating disorder risk, but also helping them manage that transition out of sport, since it's very much possible that in that stressful time, in that transitional period, that some psychological concerns may come up again. Some athletes have also talked a little bit about expectations of maintaining physique. So in some cases, athletes have talked about how they've never had any eating disorder concerns prior to retirement, but after they retired, they experienced some changes in their weight and shape and really found that to be problematic and distressing. And especially if they're a public figure, there may be some external pressures to maintain that physique. So the overall culture and messaging around how athletes should not have to maintain a physique that they had for many years as an athlete is essential to change. And then finally, this group of athletes is really under-researched and poorly understood. So this is a group that requires a lot more understanding to really to help the treatment teams get a better focus on what needs to be addressed for this group. So in terms of what's next in the last few minutes, certainly there are a number of immediate environmental changes that can be put in place, including positive coaching strategies, really celebrating body diversity, identifying and eliminating any fat talk or body comparisons or harmful messaging. And that certainly includes getting rid of the message that low weight equals success, and really helping athletes understand that help-seeking behaviors are essential in order to get them the help they need. On a systemic and cultural level, we can certainly start changing some of the incentive structures in terms of focusing on medals, to changing that and focusing on overall health and wellness. We can certainly increase our overall education for every member of the multidisciplinary treatment team and support staff around eating disorders and calling out the objectification of athlete bodies. But also making sure that we create organizational level support, including through that retirement phase, and increasing the accountability for those types of support systems to be put in place. So in terms of the highlights, I hope you feel like you have a little bit better understanding of what it might look like for an athlete to seek treatment for eating disorders, what it may look like in terms of the sport-related maintenance factors factors, athlete identity, and discussing an individual's desire to continue competing to kind of inform the overall case conceptualization. As a main takeaway, I hope that you all feel comfortable knowing that it is essential for treatment teams to really understand the nature and function of maladaptive exercise behaviors in athletes with eating disorders, and being able to come up with an effective return to play plan that's appropriate for their level of care and their eating disorder severity. And then finally, for eating disorders in athletes who are retiring, despite this being a really high risk period for various psychiatric illnesses. This is a group that could really use some additional research and support. So I hope that that's something that you're able to take back with you after today. Quick round of references, and with that, I will kick it back to Lachelle to round us out.
Thank you so much, Ms. Flatt. We're going to go ahead and quickly address any questions. I know we have a couple minutes left. Any unanswered questions will be sent to you via email 1 week from today with responses from Ms. Flatt, and you will also once again receive slides from today's presentation within an hour once the presentation ends. So the first question asks, how do you handle when an athlete doesn't want their coach to know what's going on and also maintain confidentiality?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I've run into this case many times where athletes don't feel comfortable openly disclosing what is currently going on in terms of their treatment. So sometimes that may be a discussion that is ongoing. So initially, as an athlete might be resistant to treatment or might be resistant to having an open communication with friends, family, with coaches, et cetera, that's certainly something that you absolutely want to respect from the get-go. And it's important to kind of leave that on the table as something to discuss down the line so that the coach has an opportunity to learn more, get better education, or even just be a better support system for the athlete down the line as they may feel more comfortable discussing that. You can also frame that discussion as an opportunity to help the athlete feel more invested in their treatment and their training options down the line. So that may be an opportunity to kind of loop the coach in and help the athlete understand that this is not something to penalize them. It's not something to be looked at as a consequence, but rather as an opportunity for them to really engage more with their team and help the coach understand more of what they need. So those are a couple of things that we found to be helpful.
Okay, and I'll go ahead and quickly address one more question. How do you discuss the importance of physical fitness, being fit for sport, without implying that being thin is the way to do that?
Yeah, so one of the things that we try to focus on here is one, celebrating the diverse bodies that are successful in sport. So for instance, the incredible acts done by Simone Biles, Allie Raceman, who really changed the understanding that we have of what body types can be successful in gymnastics. So being able to look to those athletes who have changed what it means to have a successful or to challenge the successful physique in sport can be helpful, but also focusing on the technique, not how an athlete looks. When you're talking about what an athlete's body can functionally do and their technique, rather than how they look or their thinness, is really a great way to go in those types of conversations and challenging the norms of the sport, or of the typical conversation in sports.
Thank you so much for that response, Ms. Flatt. I just want to go ahead and thank everyone for joining today's presentation. We will have this presentation on our training library within 1 week from today. And as I mentioned earlier, questions that were not answered during our question and answer segment will be sent to you with responses 1 week from today. Ms. Flatt, do you have any closing remarks for the attendees?
No, I just want to say thank you to you all for joining, and I hope you all were able to take something back with you. And thank you so much for just engaging with this material and hopefully being involved with changing how we think about mental health and eating disorders in sport. So I hope you enjoy your weekend.
Thank you all once again and have a great weekend.